Coming up this week on Outdoor Magazine, we're heading to the big buck state of Kansas to hunt with Ed Barton of B&C Kansas Hunts. Glad you're with us. Spent the last 3 hours looking for this bird.
I'm excited. The dogs are pumped, and they're more than excited to go.
This isn't even considered a trophy fish out here.
And I kept thinking, any minute there's going to be a buck coming through here, any minute.
All of a sudden he stepped right out in the wide open, and I made my shot.
Some bear, another bear, will be back in here before too long.
This, I believe, is a personal best for me.
I just shot the biggest buck of my life.
Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you by Jay's Sporting Goods, the Dow Chemical Company, Ameristep, the Outdoor Magazine radio show and podcast, Darton Archery, and by Dixie Dave's Wild Game Soups.
I'm working on a show right now for Outdoor Magazine Television, show I look forward to every year. It's a trip whitetail hunting to the big buck state of Kansas with my friend Ed Barton of B&C Kansas Hunts. I've hunted with Ed now several times, and there's something special about Kansas. You know, at any given time, you can see the biggest buck of your life. And that's why on this trip, I was so excited to make the drive out there. Ran into some weather, though. In fact, a lot of rain. It rained just about half the trip. I was afraid when I got there, the weather would still be terrible. The good news is about halfway to Kansas, the skies cleared, and it was clear sailing the rest of the way. I knew that this was going to be an interesting hunt. It was a full moon, which I absolutely hate hunting whitetails, in fact, anything on a full moon. But it was the first week of November, and we were in Kansas. I thought, we can overcome this full moon. What I didn't know was it was also going to be warm, pushing 70 degrees. So we had 70 degrees and a full moon. But again, it's the first week of November, and we're in Kansas. That first afternoon in the stand, I just had a feeling something was going to happen. Well, we waited a long time for that something. Just before dark, a small buck showed up on the other side of the bean field. He worked his way into where we were. It was nice to look at him, but he wasn't what we were looking for. And I was pretty well convinced this first night was going to be a bust. Then, right at dark, just to my left, I hear crunch, crunch, crunch. And I see a big buck coming in. Way too dark to shoot, really almost too dark to get him on videotape. I just got a glimpse of the right side of his rack, a big, white, heavy-beamed buck. He wandered through, he stopped, he worked a scrape about 25 yards in front of us and wandered off into the bean field. That's the last we saw of him that night. Still, I thought it was a good first night in Kansas.
Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by Carbon Express. Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by Darton Archery.
Now, the second morning, we get out to the stand very early. We're there well before the sun starts to come up, just as it starts to crack daylight, just when we can see anything that would be coming in. I hit the horns, I rattled a little bit, I grunted a little bit. That morning, we saw, again, just as it was getting light, a big buck cruising the ridge to the right of us. So now, in the span of 12 hours, we've seen two big bucks, two shooter bucks, real late in the evening and real early in the morning.
It's the first week of November here in Kansas, and you'd think the rut would be in full swing, deer running all over the place. We haven't seen that yet. We do have a full moon, though. I think that's a factor. What do they say about the rut and the full moon? When should you hunt? In the middle of the day. So that's when we're out here today. I gotta be honest, it seems a little foreign for me to come out at 11 o'clock in the morning. But if I get a big buck walk by me, I could fall in love with this in a hurry.
Turns out we sat there all day, and of course during the heat of the day, nothing moved, nothing came in. Again, we get just before dark, it starts to cool down, and a nice little 8-point comes in and makes a scrape in front of us. Now again, a 1.5-year-old buck, not something we want to shoot in Kansas. I tell you what, you look at this guy, you give him 2 years, and he is going to be quite a trophy animal. So we tried that spot on the edge of the bean field one more time. I just didn't want to give up on it. I'm in this area, had rubs and scrapes everywhere, and it was obvious the bucks had been using this area. I suspect before the full moon they were using it more during the daylight hours, but now during this full moon and during the heat, I think probably only at night. But I didn't want to give up on it. We gave it one more set, so we sat there the next morning, and again, nothing at all. I said, all right, I got to pull the plug. We're going to move to a new spot. So Ed takes us to a new stand setup, about 30 miles from where we were before, up on top of this great big hill out in the prairie. So I'm thinking, because we see a lot of rubs and scrapes everywhere, this is going to be the spot. We had a lot of activity at that second spot, does and fawns and small bucks. We saw small bucks chasing does. We knew the rut was on, but we just never saw the big buck we were looking for. I knew they were around, but we ran out of time. It just got to the point where you can only beat your head against the wall for so long. 70 degrees, full moon. I knew it was time to head back home to Michigan. I wasn't completely disappointed, though, to have to leave, because I knew that in a few short weeks I would be back. I was coming back in December to hunt with my friend Pat McKenna of Ameristep. I'll tell you what, Pat is one of the nicest guys in the business. Everybody who knows Pat loves him. I've hunted with him several times, and I enjoy it each and every time we head for the woods.
Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by the Outdoor Magazine radio show and podcast. Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by the Martin family of dealerships.
So I head back out to Kansas the first week in December, primarily to videotape Pat McKenna's gun hunt. But I thought, you know what, as long as I'm heading out here, I might as well bring my bow and sneak in a couple of days bow hunting ahead of time. Ed had an Ameristep Dominator ground blind already set up for me in an area that was overrun with bucks. He'd had a bow hunter in there earlier in the season. He'd seen 12 or 13 different bucks, so I was cautiously optimistic about this. By now, of course, the primary rut is over, but the weather's cooler, so I think I've got that in my favor, and the moon isn't nearly as bad this time. So I set in that ground blind for a day and a half. The very first afternoon out there, I had a small 1.5-year-old buck come in right in the middle of the afternoon. I thought, okay, here we go. This is the spot. But I sat there for another day and a half, saw a few small bucks, a few does, saw one nice buck very early one morning. Again, it was too dark to get a shot at him and too dark to really get him on camera. So after 2 days of bow hunting, I put down the darton, I pick up the camera, and I head out with Pat McKenna of Ameristep. I'm there to videotape his gun hunt now. Turns out we were sitting over that same bean field that I had bow hunted over very early in the season, except we were on the opposite side of the field this time. So this was kind of a familiar area to me. We hunted the first night out there, and we saw several deer, does, and even a couple of shooter bucks, but they were way, way, way to the south of us, maybe several hundred yards. The next morning, we get back out there, again, pretty slow. But that second night, everything changed.
Well, we're back out here for our second night. Came out this morning and it was just blistering cold, and it's warmed up throughout the day here. And I think we're in for a good night. The wind calmed down. We're pretty excited because it's chilled down. I think the deer will be moving tonight and we're in good shape.
We were sitting back on the edge of that cut bean field in that Ameristep Dominator blind, and Pat and I were just kind of shooting the breeze. And that's one of the things I like about gun hunting is you don't have to be quite so quiet, and you can have a little bit of a conversation. But Pat and I were out there just shooting the breeze, talking about all things in the hunting industry, and we see some deer across the field. In fact, they were back over on the other side where I was bow hunting originally. We see a doe. We see a couple of fawns, maybe a small buck. It was kind of hard to tell because it was starting to get dark, and they were working their way to the left. Then I'm thinking, well, it's not going to happen again tonight. Pat says, there's a buck. There's a shooter buck. And I looked across the field, and there he was. He had his nose down in that cut bean field, and he was eating on the other side of the field. So I got the camera set on this buck and realized now it's still legal shooting hours, but it's pretty dark, and I got that camera bumped up as bright as I can get it. I got all the light coming into that camera that I can. We got enough of an image that I could see this deer, get him on tape. Pat says, can I take him? I said, do you want that buck? And he said, absolutely. I said, go ahead and take him.
No. Up to the left.
Pat made a good shot on the buck. We didn't really wait very long. We wanted to go see what was going on. So we get out of the blind. We walk back across the bean field, back to where the deer was standing. No blood, no sign of him. I'm thinking, how can this be? I know Pat put a good hit on this animal. I wander one way, Pat wanders the other, and after about 10 yards, he yells, Mike, here he is. He's over here. He's down. So we walked up on this buck, and I'm telling you what, all you could see was that one side of the rack sticking up. I knew we had a nice animal down.
Oh, yeah. It's a big 8-pointer. This is my first Kansas hunt out here with Ed Barton with B&C Kansas Hunts. Beautiful place. Mike and I knew we had a beautiful spot over there we were sitting. Seen a lot of activity last night and this morning. And then this big boy just walked in right at the end of the day. And we were able to put a shot on him and get him. He went 20 yards here and dropped. So I could not be more excited than I am right now to hold this right here.
You know, the funny thing is, that big 8-point dropped about 20 yards from where I was bow hunting when I first came out in November. Pat shot him about 40 yards from where I was hunting, and he dropped about 20 yards from my tree stand. I'll tell you something else that's pretty interesting. Remember I told you that Ed Barton had showed us some trail cam pictures of a big 8-point? Guess which 8-point it was.
Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by the Hunter Safety System. Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you in part by Buck Fever Synthetic Scents.
Now, some great wild game wisdom from Chef Dixie Dave Miner.
These are venison kebabs, what we're going to be doing for today's recipe. You could use moose, elk, caribou, just about any of the big game as long as it's a nice tender piece. I've let this marinate overnight in our Italian dressing. You could use whatever kind of marinade you like at this point. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build this up. You want to alternate all of these different colors that we have. So what we're going to do, we'll start off with a couple of mushroom caps maybe. Put a piece of meat or two on. We'll go with a yellow pepper. Let's go with a piece of red onion. How about some tomato? Maybe another mushroom cap. How about red pepper, green pepper, another meat. Maybe another mushroom we could stick on there. Another piece of red onion, yellow pepper. Just however you feel like putting this together is totally up to you. We've been grilling for 4 or 5 minutes now. The fire's not all that hot, so let's see what we look like on this side. That's perfect. Nice, kind of charred a little bit. I think we're just about ready to take these and set it on our serving platter. This is a great way to utilize some of the more tender pieces. It's going to be a really nice, elegant dish. You'll see we're going to sprinkle a little bit of our sauce around. We're going to serve this kebab over rice, and it's just going to be great. Enjoy.
Okay, so now I'm happy for Pat. He shot his big 8-point that he'd been wanting for so long, and he's back on the airplane. He's heading back to Michigan. And you know what? I was kind of happy for myself, too, because now I could pick up the darton, and I could head back to that blind again. So I get out there the next morning. It's 8 degrees. It was so cold and nasty that morning that the deer really didn't move first thing. It was an hour after daylight on that very cold morning before the deer started to move. Then I see some does coming in front of me to eat, just 20 yards right in front of me, and a beautiful bow shot. So I'm looking at the does. They're looking off to the left. I pan the camera off to the left. I'm looking to the left, and what do I see? A big, beautiful buck looking right at us, looking at the does, and he's walking straight towards us. So I get the camera on this guy. Realize I'm by myself now, right? So I've got to get the camera turned around on the animal. I've got to try to reach to get my bow and hopefully be able to get a shot because he looks like he's coming. I think he's coming in probably to check those does out, maybe to eat. I don't know. But he was definitely coming that direction. He skirted into the edge of the woods, angled towards me. He got to about 30 yards from the blind, and he stopped. This is when I got a good look at him. Not very wide, but very tall. Real long brow tines, real long G2s, and he had a little drop tine off the right-hand side. And I thought, okay, all this time in the woods, all this time on the road coming back and forth to Kansas, it's now going to pay off, Avery. You're going to get your shot at a beautiful buck. About the time I'm thinking it's going to happen, a huge gust of wind hit the blind. The blind started to flap a little bit. He looked at me. He turned to his left, and he trotted off. And that's the last I saw of that buck.
So I guess you could say that the blind maybe cost me that buck. I don't look at it that way. Without this blind, without this Ameristep Dominator blind today to get out of this wind, I wouldn't even be out here. There's no way you could sit out in this today without some kind of shelter. So the way the deer are moving today, I got a good feeling another big boy is going to wander by. Just hope I can tough it out.
All right, so I'm excited because I know that the bucks are moving and there are big bucks in the area. The problem is I'm starting to run out of time. In fact, I've only got one more night in the blind. So that night, I go out to the same spot. I mean, after all, we've seen deer all through there. We've seen bucks in there. There's scrapes all over. I know they're using the area. I know there's the big drop tine in there. Maybe I'll see him again. So I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. Nothing's moving. Nothing is moving. Then just a little bit before dark, I see a 1.5-year-old buck come in off the hill from my right and work his way in. I'm thinking, all right, things are starting to move. This is cool. He walks in front of me. I pan to the left with him with a camera, and I stop. And in the background, looking through the viewfinder of the camera, I see here comes a big buck walking in. Now, I say big buck. He was big-bodied. He was wide. And at first, I thought he was a 6-point. He was kind of spindly, didn't have a lot of mass, but he was a big-bodied buck. So this big 6, I look at him closer now with my binos, and I see, you know what, he's actually an 8-point that he's busted off. But still, do I want to shoot this animal? I mean, he's a huge-bodied deer. He's wide, but I'm in Kansas, and I know the type of bucks that are here. I had a close encounter with a beautiful buck just a few hours earlier. So I'm thinking, I think I'm not going to shoot this guy. I let him come in. I let him come in and eat in front of me for the longest time. A couple of more 1.5-year-old bucks filtered in. So now I've got these bucks eating in front of me at 20 yards. They're giving me perfect shots. Of course, I'm not going to shoot the 1.5-year-olds. I choose not to shoot the big 6, actually 8. And in wanders a 10-point. Now, the interesting thing about this 10-point is physically, his body was so much smaller than the big broken off 8-point. I figured the broken off 8 to be about 3.5. He just didn't have good mass, but his body was huge. Now this 10-point had good mass, but his body compared to the big broken off 8 was very small. I figured he was only a 2.5-year-old buck. Now I've got a decision. I've got a big-bodied, probably 3.5-year-old broken off 8 in front of me, giving me a shot. I've got what I think is a 2.5-year-old 10-point with pretty good mass, also giving me a shot. What do? I'm not a trophy hunter, but I couldn't bring myself to shoot that 2.5-year-old 10-point, because if he's that big at 2.5, what's he going to be at 3.5? Plus, I know the quality of bucks that are running around out there. Long story short, I watched those bucks all night long, and I let them go. And that's okay. I didn't take a buck on this trip. I had close encounters. I could have taken bucks. I chose not to, and I'm okay with that. Ed Barton, you run a first-class operation. I cannot wait to come back and hunt with you again this fall, and maybe we'll get another look at that big 10-point with a drop tine.
Closed captioning of Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company. Mike Avery's Outdoor Magazine is brought to you by Jay's Sporting Goods, the Dow Chemical Company, Ameristep, the Outdoor Magazine radio show and podcast, Darton Archery, and by Dixie Dave's Wild Game Soups.